Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. So, today's a special day for me personally. One of my favorite things in life is to get to introduce people that I love to other people that I love. And I'm blessed that I have a lot of people that I love. Our speaker today is probably the most remarkable man, one of the most remarkable men I know. I'm going to get emotional. I thought I could get through it, but one of the most remarkable men I know. He has been, we met a long time ago, but when we were both young and cute. Actually, he was young and cute, I was just young. So 30 years later, we're still doing life and trying to figure it out and take the next step, and it's taken us on a remarkable journey. But he, not only being a musician and an actor and then moving into the spiritual realm where he became a minister. He served it for the last 8 years at the Atlanta Center for Spiritual Living, and always asking this question of how do we serve more. But if that wasn't enough, he also founded the Kaleidoscope Child Foundation, and they've created an orphanage and school in Cambodia and now in India and now working on one in Guatemala. And if that weren't enough, he's written a book and he writes for the Science of Mind magazine. He's getting the Walden Award this week. Pulitzer Prize is not far away. Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it's like, just what else? So thank you for making me smell small and insignificant, my friend. No, actually, he's got a wonderful heart, and I'm just so thrilled that he came. One thing I do want to make you aware of, that this project that has kind of taken over his life, I think, of serving these young people around the world, is an opportunity for others to participate. And so if it speaks to your heart to go to Cambodia for 10 days with Dr. David and to serve these young people and have an amazing, what do you call it, a volunteer? Yeah, amazing experience. That's available for you as well. He'll have his books and invite you to stay for the workshop. So without anything more, please help me welcome my friend, Dr. David Ault.
I noticed that he called Daniel young, and I noticed that he did not call me young, and so I've duly noted. Yes, duly noted. And you, I don't know if you might have to do a live version of that song, because the choir did call in response, and so they're going to need to be recorded on that. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much. And what a wonderful opportunity to be before you. And I reflect back on the decades that Marty and I have known each other and been involved in ministry. And I can truly say that the intention and the aim is still the same as when it all began. In fact, my first teacher was Louise Hay. I don't know if any of you remember who Louise was. But through a set of circumstances, moving to Los Angeles and reconnecting with some people that I had gone to university with, we became a trio called Alliance, and we used to work with Louise, and then we traveled with her for about 3 years. So you can imagine what it was like being on the road with Louise Hay in the early days, and what a crash course in observation and empathy and high volume listening and all of the skills that are required in order to be with people who are hurting, in order to be with people who are searching. And I find that same level of seeking and hurting and searching still exists among us, even when we've been entrenched in spirituality. Because we live as spiritual beings and we are having a spiritual experience, but the density sometimes of what it is to be in the day-to-day human skin suit, that I like to call it, can be a lot. And that's why we always incessantly talk about spiritual practice. What do we do? How do we center? How do we ground ourselves? And so long ago, I knew that the intention and the aim of being in a pastoral position was to help migrate people from their pain to a sense of hope. But hope wasn't a stopping point. That then you go from hope to a state of belief. And everybody has beliefs, right? A lot of our beliefs stem from our domestication and our religious upbringing and our opinions. And so it's not even enough to have a collection of beliefs. But what spirituality, what metaphysics, New Thought teaches us is to move even from belief to a place of knowing. A place of knowing. That in spite of whatever is happening in our world of effect, that we have this unshakable sense of knowing that all that is real and all that exists is this idea, this energy, this life force that we call God. How are we all doing with that sense of knowing in today's world? Right? It takes work, doesn't it? And so that's always been the aim, and that's always been the intention, and that's always the practice, is how do I strengthen my sense of knowing? I teach often a phrase that goes like this: even in the apparent absence of. Say that. Even in the apparent absence of. So think of that. Even in the apparent absence of peace, there is peace. Even in the apparent absence of love, there is love. Even in the apparent absence of divine order, there is. So my favorite quote, do you have a favorite quote? My favorite quote of all times is from the study of A Course in Miracles, and it says, "Love brings up everything unlike itself." Wow. And I used to go, what does that mean? Love brings up everything unlike itself. And I would study that quote, and it finally dawned on me one day exactly what that was encouraging me or pulling me to know. And that is, if I stand in front of people and I say, I am an advocate for peace, then guess what? Everything unlike peace comes before me, not to test me, but to make good on my advocacy. In other words, to bring my words into a place of integrity. If I say I'm an advocate for love, then everything that appears unlike love does what? Rises up before me in order to give me the opportunity to really practice what it is that I say that I am. And so it's the same thing. That's where knowing comes in. Is that everything that appears unlike divine order pops its head up pretty much all the time, doesn't it? And so we are in a perpetual state of practice. And so I want to play a little game with you. So take your hand. All right? Everybody's got to do it. All right? You've got to take your hand, and you're going to put it over your eyes like this. So just keep it over, block your vision. And so I want you to imagine that your hand over your eyes is sort of like our day-to-day issues or problems. So this represents the friction that's going on inside our household. This represents some debt that we are challenged. This represents a diagnosis that we are scared about. This represents a grievance or a hurt or a sense of abandonment. This represents a fear of what's going to happen to me when this particular thing ends. This represents all kinds of ambiguity and uncertainty. This represents someone cutting me off in traffic. This represents all kinds of things that are agitating. So keep your hand up over your eyes. What do you know, though, that is beyond the hand? Do you know that there is something beyond the hand? Do you know that there is a wide spectrum, a landscape that holds all kinds of solution, right? So even with this over our eyes, there is a knowing that there is a solution that is there. Even with this hand over our eyes, we remember that there are options that we haven't even yet explored, correct? And so this hand then over our eyes represents what we like to call the tree. And you know that famous saying, I can't see the forest for the... Now take the tree down. Oh my God, look, there's a whole world, a whole forest out there that we forgot about, right? So how many of us then in our day-to-day existence are operating from this. Our language is about this. When we go to lunch with our friends, this is what we talk about, right? And one of the things that I often encourage is that we have to become aware of our tree nature. And by tree nature, I'm talking about the way in which we converse, obsess, think about, stay awake at night, think incessantly over and over and over again about the tree, about the issue, about the thing that becomes that volume and that wave and that perpetual experience of worry. How do we then take that down and cultivate a practice of remembering that there is a forest? And what does the forest represent? The forest represents, again, all of the options that you and I haven't really explored yet. And what we know about spiritual law is that what we focus on, we get more of, correct? So if what I'm focusing on is the tree all the time, if what I'm talking about is the tree all the time, what's my relationship with the forest going to be? It's going to kind of go back to the hope syndrome, which is at the beginning. We're going to hope that there's a forest, but are we really going to know that there is a forest? So how do we get to a place of knowing that that forest exists? So my aim and my intention is to cultivate forest people. I want the world to be filled with forest people, not tree people, forest people. And so I want to ask you today, are you willing to re-examine your relationship in being a forest person? A forest person is someone who operates from vision. Have you ever really tried to define what a vision is? A vision is so vast, a vision is so big, that we will spend the rest of our lives trying to incorporate that, reveal that, see that, be that, until we take our last breath. And the vision is so big that we will never complete it in our lifetime. But vision requires some good old-fashioned, what we call devotion. When was the last time that you really sat down and said, what am I devoted to? Am I devoted to the tree and the management of the tree? Or am I devoted to the forest? And you see the difference? Because if I'm devoted to the forest, it means then that I have to operate from a leading edge sensibility. It means that I really have to cultivate and know in faith that what it is that I feel inside is true and real. Because in the forest energy, there is provision. This whole month, I know that you've been looking at some of Lynn Twist's work, and you've been talking about prosperity and abundance. And what we understand is that in our belief system, we can't really fully experience that level of prosperity if we are tree people. If all that we are trying to do is to manage things. But we move into a sense of prosperity, into a sense of abundance, into unexplored territory, when we begin to practice our sense of knowing and our sense of vision and allowing ourselves to become forest people, to operate from vision. And so here's how we migrate. And I love to give tangibles. I love to give takeaways, things that you can use, practical application. And so here's the thing that has worked best for me with regards to cultivating my forest nature. Sometime in the 90s, I was reading this article by a travel writer. I believe his name was Doug Boyd. And I forget what he was talking about, but somewhere in that article there was a little short paragraph, and he said this: the most powerful mantra that you can ever say is, "I'm available." And then he said, look out, because if you're sincere, your whole world is going to change. Look out. In other words, don't go around and saying I'm available if you don't mean it. So again, it's kind of like that Course in Miracles quote, love brings up everything unlike itself. So if you say I'm available, but you're not sincere about being available, then don't say it. But if you are truly, truly earnest in your desire to live more in that state of expansion and vision, if you are truly earnest in letting go the shackles of whatever it is, the themes that have held us down into this level of smallness, then just do that. Just say, I'm available. And here's what benefits that. You and I get to get clear on what our values are. And when I talk about values, I'm talking about the things that govern what you say yes and what you say no to. Do you know what your top 5 values are if I were to come to you and say, tell me what your values are? One of mine is adventure. I grew up in Beaumont, Texas, in a very poor experience, very cliched, but many people have had that. But I was the last of a tribe of children, and by the time that I came along, all resources were gone, and everybody was tired, and no one wanted to do anything with me. And so I climbed up trees. I climbed up trees and I read books, and I fantasized about what it would be like to escape this particular environment. What it would be like to move away from the abuse, what it would be like to move away from the poverty. And so adventure was fostered in me long before I even knew that that was a value. Because I would read in books about all of these people. You know, I had a rusted bicycle with a little rusted basket, and I would ride it to the local library. And I remember I was so tiny and so short that they would have to lean over the counter. And they had a series of autobiographies for young readers. And you were only allowed to check out 3 books at a time. And I would grab 7 and I would plead, please let me have 7 at a time. And they would, and I would put them in my little basket and I would ride home, and up the trees I would go and I would read for days and days and days. George Washington Carver, Walt Disney, Abner Doubleday, the inventor of baseball. I would read all of these stories over and over and over again. And what I began to identify about all of them was this tenacity, this vision, that even in spite of whatever earthly obstacle was happening to them, that they would keep going. And that requires vision. That requires not being able to see the whole stair step, but to continue to climb up it anyway. That requires a commitment of faith. And so adventure became one of my values, and it's still one of my values today. And one of the things that I do when I look at my values, spiritual development is a value. Health is a value. All of the things that mean something to me. And when I look at my values, I say literally out loud, I'm available. I'm available. And like that travel writer said, look out, because your whole world starts to change. And so the things that are in alignment with those values start to show up, and doors begin to open, and synchronistic meetings begin to happen. And you and I become hyper vigilant and aware of what we say yes and what we say no to. And so as we begin to cultivate being a forest person, it requires that day-to-day due diligence. And so with that sense of adventure, and having grown up in Beaumont, Texas, I wanted to see the world. And there was very little means for me to be able to do that. But as I got older and as I aged and as I began to work with Louise and as I began to cultivate a sense of self, opportunities began to show up for me. You know, those companies that let you sign up, and if you get 15 people, your trip is free. That was big in the 90s, in the mid-90s and the late 90s. And so I would use my mailing list, and I would gather all these people, and before you know it, I was in China, and I was in Peru, and I was all over the world seeing things, and I felt like that sense of adventure was alive for me. And one of those trips in the early 2000s was to Thailand and Cambodia. And I had never been to either place. I knew nothing about Cambodia. I had no idea that the world's largest spiritual temple complex is in Siem Reap, Cambodia. It's called Angkor Wat. And it is so huge and so magnificent and so extensive that you can never see all of it. Days and days and days of all the different temples that are there. And so we go to Thailand, which is lovely. And then we embark and we fly over shortly to Cambodia. And have you ever traveled to some place and the moment that you land, something visceral happens inside of you? You feel like, I know this place. This feels familiar. Well, that was what was going on when we landed there. And it was quite primitive. This was back in 2004. Today, it's much different. But in 2004, the main road was still a dirt road. The airport was this tiny little thing. And the delineation between the haves and the have-nots was very big. The haves were the tourists, and the have-nots were the local Cambodian people. So 2004, so do the math. They had a major civil war in the 1970s, a genocide that killed more than 2 million Cambodian people. And it was from an oligarch who took over that country. And if you were educated, if you wore glasses, if you had your own business, if you were a musician, if you were a creative type, you were forced to go into the rice fields and work until you died. And there's a movie called The Killing Fields that showcases what happened to those Cambodian people. So do the math. Only 30 years had passed since then when we landed. That means that entire generations of Cambodians were wiped out. And we landed and we're seeing all of this. During that civil war, they used landmines. So if you remember Princess Diana, before she passed away, the last thing that she was doing was helping to excavate the landmines out of the country of Cambodia. Many of those landmines were made out of plastic, and they would bury them in all these different fields across the country. Then guess what? Recycling became popular. And so now you've got people in Cambodia who are looking for plastic to recycle. And if the landmines had not been excavated, they would go and they would see where the soil would wear down, and then it would blow their arms and legs off. And so it was a big issue. So we land there, and this is what we see. We see third world conditions. We can see the landmine victim. We can see all kinds of hardship. And the natural thing within people when they're in that environment is I want to do something. I want to help. And that was not uncommon. And I went to our guide and I said, I have 15 people and they want to do something. And I said, but I have a special request. I want you to take us to the worst possible place. Because if this is going to be a one-off, I want our time spent and our intention in serving to be its most optimum. So very quickly he told me about the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the largest waterway in that part of Asia. And in the dry season, the water recedes so much that a transient village pops up on the riverbank. And that's where you would have refugees and orphans and landmine people and the poorest of the poor. And he said, if you really want to help, I would go and I would feed the children on the banks of the Tonle Sap Lake. And I said, how will we do that? And he said, well, you can't just show up and you can't just bring anything. You would need to find food that is indigenous to their digestive system. So that means that you would have to buy food from the local markets. A local market would be where, let's say that you are a Cambodian family and you either farm or you gather produce and you come and you would sell all of that for a week. And he said, I would go to the local markets and I would gather, and he suggested some of the things that we buy. And so we all agreed in the group that we would do this, and we went to where the local markets were, and we descended on these local markets, and we bought out 3 families worth of food. That means three markets. We took everything that they had. I can only imagine what those 3 families thought. Oh my God, it's Monday and you've now taken all of our stuff. But we took everything, and we got a fleet of vans to put it all in. When I went to pay for it, guess how much it cost? $86. For 3 local markets worth of food. That was the moment. That was the moment when the words "I'm available" started to echo through, because I stood there and I went, wow, even I can do something that might be sustainable. I don't know what that looks like. Here's the vision part. I don't know what that looks like. But what I do know is my opportunity, and the vision tells me to show up. And so we got to the area, to the Tonle Sap, and I still to this day don't know how our guide did it, but he said, I've got to get a message to those people. I've got to get a message to the matriarch of that village. So even a transient village has a matriarch. And this was before the advent of cell phones. You know what's so funny about traveling in third world countries now is that you'll see monks walking around talking on their cell phones. Everybody's got a cell phone. But back then, that was obsolete. And yet, when we arrived, there were more than 100 children that were sitting uniformly on that riverbank, just sitting there waiting. And so we began to distribute the food, and it was orderly and beautiful for about 7 minutes. And then off in the distance, you could hear this thunderous roar of running, and we all looked up, and there were hundreds more children running towards us. And when they got there, there was a grabbing frenzy, and we began to distribute everything that we had. And it seemed as though within 10 minutes after that, it was all over. And the storm sort of settled, and one woman looked down, and we were covered in these little tiny handprints. And she said, "This is the canvas of humanity." And we all stood there, and something began to happen inside of me. I could feel this wave of emotion. And I wasn't the type of person that wanted to display that wave of emotion in front of people. And I'm looking all around me for a place to go, and there's nothing except a pontoon boat that's sitting in the smelly water. And I remember crawling on my hands and knees into that pontoon boat and just sobbing and wailing. But the unique thing about that was that it was not out of pity. I was having what I could only describe as a mystical experience of I was that child, and that child was me. It was as if young David, who had hidden up in the trees when I was so young reading, was the same as the child who was receiving the food that was distributing. To try to put words to it diminishes the experience. But it was so remarkable. And in that pontoon boat, I remember on my hands and knees saying, I'm available. I'm available. And that's the beauty of a vision, is that the more that we say that, the more that we become clear about our values, the more that we become dedicated to being forest people. You don't have to have it figured out. In fact, very rarely do we have it figured out. Very rarely do we know the how. But what begins to happen is that this universal energy starts pulling us, this guidance, this intuitive nature, this synchronicity, all of the signs and the wonders that are a match to that start to pull us. And if we pay attention, then that forest becomes more and more clear. And we realize that that forest is that place of provision. We realize that that forest is that place of purpose. We will never be available to the forest if we focus on this. Every single day, we have to become aware of taking this down, taking this down, taking this down, taking this down, reminding one another with love. Let's talk about forest things. One of the ways that we can do that is when we eat with one another, when we visit. A lot of times I will tell my students, become aware of your language around meals at restaurants. Have you ever noticed that most of that conversation is about what's not working? And so make a commitment that maybe once or twice a month, that when I do gather together, it's not going to be about that. It's going to be focused entirely on what is working. It's going to be focused entirely on what it is to be a forest person and what our vision is. And so from saying I'm available and going back year after year, making a lot of mistakes. Today we have 2 schools that Reverend Marty told you about in Siem Reap, Cambodia. We have an IT tech center. Some of the kids are learning coding. We have a sewing center. And we serve more than 600 children in Cambodia alone. And then we've replicated that in India. And we've started to create similar initiatives in Guatemala. And like Reverend Marty said, all of a sudden that vision, that forest experience has sort of taken over my life. So much so that I've made a pivotal decision, and I'm stepping down from pulpit ministry at the end of the year. I have no idea what it's going to look like. I have no idea what that's going to look like. But that part of me inside that says I'm available keeps getting louder and keeps pulling more and more. This past year in March, I lived in a slum in India. And they have an after-school program that my foundation is starting. And those kids meet in a cow barn on the floor. And the cow barn wall is patched with cow dung, which brings cow flies, which makes the aroma quite lovely. And I've never been more happy in my life than sitting in that cow barn with those kids who are learning for the very first time. And so we're committed to building the very first school that slum has ever had. And I know that a great part of 2019 will be the commitment of seeing that project through. And that's the kind of stuff that presents itself. That's the kind of stuff that makes me want to get up in the morning. That's the kind of stuff that reminds me that our purpose, not just my purpose, but our collective purpose, is to do everything within our power to say yes to that forest nature. So I leave you with this. Do you believe that the forest exists? Yes. The forest is solution. Do you believe that solution already exists? Yes. That's been my 3 favorite words. Solution already exists. I want you to think about the impact of that. That even in the midst of whatever it is that is the tree for you right now, do you realize unilaterally, simultaneously, that the solution to that already exists? How do we become available to that? How do we become available to the solution? It starts with taking this down. I look so forward to sharing the idea that revealed itself to me around worry with you this afternoon, because it was transformative for me. It's simple, it's tangible, and I'm going to say it right here, it's going to change your life. So don't leave stay and let us continue the dialogue. But first of all, thank you so much for the privilege and the opportunity to be able to speak with you this morning. Thank you. God bless. Thank you. I'll let you do the prayer.
Give us a minute. We got a whole bunch of stuff that happens before, but I love that you're excited. So what do you think? Isn't he remarkable? So let's just take a moment to give thanks for this day and for the blessings. The inspirational message reminding us that indeed there is a forest, and that we must return to that awareness again and again when we return to the divine nature of who we are and the world in which we live. We know that wholeness is the order of the day, and that wholeness expresses as health and well-being and vitality. We know that peace exists. And so we allow our hearts to be filled with that peace that passes human understanding. We remember that we are abundant beings, that we delightfully participate in the divine flow, joyously giving and graciously receiving of the divine bounty. We know that indeed love is the only reality. And so we fully and freely forgive ourselves and those who we perceive to have harmed us. We are blessed. So we give thanks for this day and for all of the blessings. We remember that the solution exists. So I'm just knowing that whatever the problem is, the solution exists. And we are open, we are receptive and available to that truth. For all of these blessings and so many more, I simply give thanks as together we say, and so it is.